All right, and we're back. Everyone gets to see me again, and I won't talk about myself quite as much. I'm going to let these guys talk more about Bitcoin lending, common sense yield to Bitcoin, because everything we've been talking about today has been very tokenized real world assets, and a lot of what's happening here, of course, in Denver is very on-chain Ethereum, very DEXs and such. But now we're going back to the original, to Bitcoin, to, as we'll say, the most pristine collateral we've ever seen. And now we want to talk about lending, because if we talk about real world adoption, nothing has been adopted quite as much as Bitcoin. So first, I'm going to let you guys talk about yourself.
Bringing RWA tokens to Bitcoin layer 2s. I think since I've found that the issue is not so much bringing these tokens, it's more so unlocking the demand among Bitcoin audiences. And you're talking about a base of investors, I think, that's pretty unique with an on-chain audiences. I mean, RWAs, what's the biggest roadblock? It's, you try to deploy them, you're offering 15, maybe 20% yield to Web3 audiences, they're not excited about it. But Bitcoin, you're talking about a more serious investor base. You're talking about people who are a little bit more risk averse. And so when you offer them something like 5, 10, 15, they're actually interested. So that's kind of like the problem space I'm really involved in, is how can you unlock demand among those novel investor bases, really unblock RWA adoption, and do it with an audience that I think, frankly, most of the industry is overlooking. So it's me in a nutshell.
All right, I'll start with this. We talked about Bitcoin being like the kind of pristine collateral. It is, some people say the most pristine collateral we've seen because of the transparency, because of the limited supply. How do you? I guess we'll start with this. Talking about lending in Bitcoin, Bitcoin being kind of like the as I say, like the Rockefellers, right? Those that have been in Bitcoin for a while have seen it go from virtually zero to wherever it is today. And we all like, oh my gosh, it's down to 86,000 today. And 5 years ago, we would have been ecstatic to talking about it being down to 86,000. So how do you go about lending it and maintaining that liquidity and maintaining that collateral when it is still a relatively volatile asset?
Yeah, so we think the best way to unlock this is through the options market and hedging. So there's a lot of OTC liquidity from Bitcoin to USD. We actually think one of the better financial layers in terms of trust and programmability is obviously Ethereum. So we use things like CBBTC and other liquid staking tokens that are starting to kind of come out that basically bring Bitcoin over to Ethereum in secure ways. So the way we do that is basically through a swap up front combined with a Bitcoin for Bitcoin loan, which is part of where that yield comes from, because there's a lot of specific tax structuring that has to go on that helps kind of generate some of that yield. So, but in terms of just collateral, the whole industry really runs on margin, and if that's why we have these big wicks down, is if one person starts to get margin called, everybody starts to get margin called, and the great borrowers of our day, i.e. the governments, hide out in 2-year, 5-year, 30-year duration. They don't live their life 12 seconds away from a margin call on Aave. They do it out in 5 years, 3 years, wherever they can get liquidity from institutional investors. So we want to be a part of developing the kind of Bitcoin capital markets and help capital formation continue to happen with kind of this futuristic investment bank type concept.
Okay, so Jullian, you were talking about you've actually utilized the Bitcoin network to create kind of RWAs on Bitcoin. So how does that feed into what we're talking about today, which is, and I talked about with Provost, which is digital native loans, and you can do it on the Bitcoin network. So can we talk a little bit about how we do that? Because Bitcoin L2s, I know there's a big push to them. It's a little bit difficult because of the technology, because of the slower times and such. So how are you doing Bitcoin RWAs, in particular lending our assets?
Yeah, I think step one is realizing that if a Bitcoin holder, a large one at least, is going to engage in any sort of like lending arrangement, it can't be margin based, right? What J. Paul just said is critical. If you have a big miner, right, like the one I used to work at, you're talking about holding thousands of Bitcoin, you're talking about shareholders, there's a board behind all of this sort of question, and you're talking about people who fundamentally are not crypto natives. So, something like even the Aave user experience is something that is it's almost blasphemous, right, to like a TradFi sort of hedge fund guy, right, coming in, managing a Bitcoin treasury, and all of a sudden being expected to do something like that. And so I think step one, before we even get into the technology, it's actually having the lending primitive to be able to lend in the way that you would expect in a TradFi market, right? In the way where you can go home to your kids at 5 p.m. and come back the next day to work at 9 a.m., right? It's very simple things that I think we overlook. So step one is that, just having a user experience that makes sense to a more mainstream audience, because truthfully, Bitcoin is becoming more mainstream. These are the types of holders that exist. When we get onto the technology front, I think there it's pretty interesting. My first year at Marathon, I was building out a Bitcoin layer 2. Tried it, it's a very difficult process. I think the biggest issue is that there really is no such thing as Bitcoin layer 2s. I think that kind of like starts from there. Like layer 2 means unilateral exit, and there's no such thing other than with the Lightning Network. And so that's not supposed to mean that the Lightning Network is the best scaling solution. It's just to mean that most Bitcoin L2s are actually just side chains. And when you're talking about a side chain, that means you're bringing Bitcoin into a different network. There are trust assumptions. And so really, like when you get back to the core of it, how does Bitcoin lending work on a Bitcoin L2 or a Bitcoin sidechain? There's going to be trust assumptions in how you get Bitcoin to that network in the first place. And so step one is having a better bridge. You need better bridging infrastructure, or rather just kind of better bridging distribution, right? I think these like bridge Bitcoin assets like WBTC are like one opportunity, but the L2s have to do a better job in getting users to sort of feel at ease, right? With the fact that, okay, their Bitcoin's on a different network, maybe it's even a staking network. What are the, how do the dynamics of that work? Could there be like smart contract risk? Could there be protocol risk? All of these sort of questions. So it's user experience, it's the technology has to be seamless, and the other part of it is just marketing. I think honestly most of the L1s that are coming out today, and even L2s, and especially Bitcoin L2s, they're trying to jump on the staking narrative, and I just am so fundamentally opposed to that, because you're trying to pitch an EVM sort of product to an audience that has historically disliked that sort of value prop. If Bitcoiners wanted to play around like degens, they would go into WBTC, which 13 billion of it already is doing. Right, the 2 trillion market cap isn't jumping into that sort of stuff because they're not fundamentally interested. And so I think a lot of it comes down to like reshaping how these L2s are really going to market. I think RWA is an important component of it. And until we have good lending, i.e. what Jay Paul's talking about here, that's really going to unlock that sort of Bitcoin capital.
Yeah, and so just address like the smart contract piece, the protocol piece, when you have assets that are custodied on the L0 or the L-1 of basically the legal system, in the US or somewhere, that's a pretty trusted bridge these days, especially for institutional clients. And so that's why RapidBTC works, that's why CBBTC works. A lot of these kind of Bitcoin derivatives, or not derivatives, but basically like custody tokens are doing well. So, the nice same thing with the dollar, right? You've got USDC, USDT. If we get hacked, it's basically the real fiat is at Circle's bank accounts in the US banking system. The Bitcoin is at Coinbase, or it's at BitGo. So that really makes a huge difference, and that's the only way that I think we're going to continue to get institutional folks on chain, using Bitcoin-based finance. The nice thing is you've got an incredibly fast bookkeeping system, an extremely scalable system where Ethereum is basically incentivizing people to run servers for you, so you don't have to run all your own back office and tech and operations and have 1,000 people in Bangalore or Jersey City, the way we used to at Goldman, which I learned a ton from Goldman, incredible place, so only want to speak positively there. But that was the only way to scale with the tech that we had was people, paper, and eventually kind of improving things over time. So I think that the timing of the why now and how you build your business based on the technology available is super important. So we're fortunate enough to get to start from scratch and kind of do it the right way for the next 100 years.
So I think something interesting that you both brought up is the fact that those that are holding Bitcoin, especially significant amounts of Bitcoin, are not the same as the degens, right? They're not ETH degens. They don't care about within a second transaction times, right? They're not looking to borrow against that right away and then sell it. They're not looking at smart contracts like that. But they're still kind of in the Bitcoin crypto world. They're still digital. They have this asset that they probably bought at a very low rate at a very low basis. They have to keep in mind the tax consequences of doing anything with it. But they want to be able to borrow against it, just like they borrow against any other asset that they have. So we have to meld this idea of you have this asset, it's at a very low basis, you have tax consequences if you sell it, with the fact that you might want cash, you might want to do something with it, you might want to start a business, buy a house, buy a car, just use the wealth that you've created, but do so not on the same rails that we've been using for a while, but the same ideas. So is that kind of the direction you're both thinking about that is now we have this new collateral.
Exactly. Like, if you're 35 and maybe you crushed it on Bitcoin, there's literally somebody in prison right now who didn't understand the tax system who, was there for tax evasion because they sold their Bitcoin and bought a house and they're like, I did everything right. What did I do wrong here? Unfortunate, but those are the people that we're going to try to reach with ads and referrals and all the above to try to save them from themselves, to try to help them optimize their U.S. tax situation. So the cap gains problem is a multi-$100 billion problem. I don't want to frame it as a problem because if you're the government, it's a great thing, but helping people think more optimally when these are options that are out there, and just giving people more autonomy. And helping them do it in a way that it's a 2 or a 3% Bitcoin interest rate as opposed to a 14% rate with a lot of the kind of traditional lenders of today that I won't name. But
yeah, I think another important bit is in terms of so I think most Bitcoin treasury holders met a lot of these CFOs at big mining companies and big Bitcoin funds, and they know that this is that they're sitting on this really valuable asset that it should be able to produce something. I mean, most of these guys are TradFi, they've been working at hedge funds, they know asset management really well, but it's kind of where is that cash flow coming from, right? How are they, earning dividends on their Bitcoin? How are they earning yield on their Bitcoin? And really most of the product offerings nowadays, it's, well, here's some random other token that we can give you for locking up your Bitcoin. And once you have this random token, good luck selling it. Something that I saw a lot within the context of big mining companies is, people would pitch these sort of products all the time. And then the question becomes, well, okay, let's assume we did, right? Take on this random token you're offering us. How do we then sell it? And actually, I personally saw a situation in which we basically jumped into a particular chain, had a bunch of its token, and then really weren't able to sell it for months. And so the value prop of, all right, here's some passive income to earn on your Bitcoin actually was never realized because the fundamental token, the cash flow itself came in a way that we weren't able to finance any expenditures. We weren't able to invest in new CapEx. And so we just kind of ignored that world altogether. And so I think kind of this narrative, this altcoin yield driven DeFi narrative, it's almost damaging, right? Because with the Bitcoin side of things, they know that they need this passive income. They know that they need to operationalize this asset, but it needs to be in a way that they understand. And I mean, that's the benefit of events like these, right? RWAs and trying to really jump into the forefront of finding ways to bring on off-chain business value props on-chain. It's going to be especially appealing to Bitcoin audiences because you're talking about, as you mentioned, people who bought this asset a very long time ago, right? They're not often getting into the asset because of some fundamental faith in, I don't know, UTXO blockchains, right? They're getting into it because they see it as an investment asset and they really want to use it. And so to the extent that we can offer them products that make sense, right, to that sort of to those dimensions, right? That's the only way that this thing's going to scale.
Yeah, and the reason we're talking about lending at an RWA day is what do you think the first thing people do when they take out a huge loan? They buy RWA. So hopefully they're putting it in. I mean, that 42% thing earlier sounded pretty good, the reinsurance tokenized security. So might have to, just keep paying a really low rent and go buy that. So, but yeah, I think the days of, you need to buy, I think, yeah, just finding ways to continue to borrow instead of sell and kind of, we actually did this webinar a while back, buy, borrow, die is kind of the meta, which is a game return for most effective tactics available. So that's kind of that's what we want to bring to more people and make happen easier.
All right, guys. Well, I appreciate it. And one thing I wanted to also get across is, it's not really a question because we're out of time, but that I've heard from the two of you and that I know from experience is we're talking about this for those that have quite a bit of Bitcoin, huge stacks of Bitcoin, and then they're going, okay, I need to actually be able to spend money and use money and live my life like I have this level of wealth. But being able to have better lending, lower interest rates, less worry about the volatility of it is what's going to allow it to be an asset that is in more people's portfolios, even if they're not worth $1 billion, because it's going to be a useful asset. It's going to be something they can use as collateral, even if they have one Bitcoin and that Bitcoin's worth $100,000, they're going to be able to use that and go, maybe I can borrow against that instead of selling it or selling some other assets. So as we are able to create more of this Bitcoin-based lending, we're going to be able to bring that down so that most people can have that as a viable asset when they're not just hoping it goes up. They're going, okay, now this is valuable and useful for me.
Yeah, collateral equals utility. I think it's that simple. And by the way, the scarcity equals utility because we've got money supply up and to the right, and nothing wrong with that. The world needs more medium of exchange, but doesn't have to be the store of value too. So more people can get that too, the better.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the RWA team again for having us and having me this many times in front of you. I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you around.